Hello, class. My name is Corey Johnson, and today I'm going to be talking with you about behavioral and social learning theory. When you think about behavioral learning theory and you see this graphic, the person who probably comes to mind is Pavlov and Pavlov's dog. So, Pavlov was born in Russia in 1849. He originally was planning to be a priest like his father, but he decided to devote his life in 1870 to physiology and spent most of his career studying pancreatic nerves, the heart, the human body, and animals as well and their behavior. And he received the Nobel Prize in 1904 for his work. What he was known best for was what we call classical conditioning now. He did some work where he worked with a dog and he trained a dog to salivate after he rang a bell. You can see the process here in the graphic. He first put food in front of the animal, which produced an unconditioned reaction of salivation, and then he would ring a bell, and which he called that a neutral stimuli. And then he would combine the two, the food and the bell, to create an association. Over time, he would just simply ring the bell, and eventually the dog would remember that association and would create a conditioned response of salivation before he would even put any food down. Some of the other workers who found similar results in their studies were Edward Thorndike, John Watson, and B.F. Skinner. They all, in their separate practices and studying animals and different theories, understood that behavior could be affected by the environment. That using positive and negative reinforcement, Skinner realized, was another way of adapting and controlling behavior. You can see here Skinner's model. He had a rat in a box and he trained it to press down a lever and it would receive a reward of a pellet. And he also introduced some negative reinforcers, as you can see there in the graphic, an electric grid to shock the rat. So over time, Skinner realized that introducing these rewards and punishments could increase or even decrease the probability of a certain behavior. And as many of these theorists began to put these into practice, they realized some similarities, as you can see here with this graphic, that the subject was thinking about a reward, was thinking about food, and in each case, one is more of an involuntary response, the other one was voluntary because of the consequence that was attached with it. So here are some of the basic principles of theory, as I mentioned earlier, that the environment can affect the behavior, and really these men and women believed that the way to access the mind was observing the behavior. And they really believed that feedback was critical, as we know in education how important feedback is through peer collaboration and peer observation. They also learned about transferring of abilities or behaviors from one context to another through generalization, or that reinforcing a behavior in one setting is not necessarily going to work in another through discrimination. So think about it for a minute. Think about how environment can influence behavior, or if other things influence behavior as well. Think about how we use classical conditioning in our schools. Think about the dismissal bell or the fire alarm. And also think about how you've used operant conditioning, whether you've used a treasure box, whether you've used stickers, or whether you used the threat of punishments, like sending a student to timeout. We're going to transition now and talk a little bit about social learning theory, which was really developed later as a response to behaviorist theory. Albert Bandura, who's actually a professor at Stanford University, 93 years old, still teaching strong, he realized that there was more going on than simply environmental effects on behavior, but that behavior could also influence an environment. And later on, after a lot of trial and error, he also realized that the mind could affect either of those pieces as well. He coined the phrase reciprocal determinism, showing the relationship between an environment and behavior, and he really championed modeling and observation models. His most famous study is what we call the Bobo doll study, where he took an inflatable doll and had one of his students beat up this doll with punching and with hammers and different things, and he filmed the student, and then he took the film and played it for a group of kindergartners, and they loved it. They thought it was hilarious. And then he placed these students in a similar environment with similar tools and a blow-up doll, and the students imitated what they saw in the film. They weren't coerced, they weren't bribed, they just followed the practices of modeling and imitated. So Bandura continued on with his research and kind of developed these 4 phases of the modeling process. First of all, attention. As we all know, that it's a struggle to keep students' attention no matter what age they are, and that negative influences that affect attention will affect the learning. Second of all, retention is important, being able to recall or reproduce what was learned with an image or verbally, and then translating that into some kind of action, which of course under the surface we know that the motivation piece is critical, the why behind it, that you're not going to have that true understanding and mastery without that motivation piece. And that's where Bandura incorporated the mind into this whole triangle of influencing. So he and other social theorists believe that behavior could be influenced not just by the environment, but also through the mind, by culture. Internal and external factors were both equally powerful. And that motivation was influenced by past things, future influencers, as well as observed influencers. He also spent a lot of time crafting what I think really fueled the self-help movement of self-regulation. Was this theory that they proposed of that self-regulation is how we can control our behavior with observations, with judgment, with self-response, as we become more self-aware, as we learn to set realistic expectations for ourselves and celebrating our victories. This can help us have a positive self-regulation. So now you can try to apply it in your context. Do you think that behavior can also influence the environment around someone? What other factors do you believe influence the environment? In what ways do we see observational learning in school? I was a first-year teacher this year, and so I know that observations are very important. And then in what ways have you used modeling? I know modeling is a huge thing, especially when it comes to teaching procedures in a classroom. So just to wrap it up, I want to just give us a moment to compare and contrast the 2 theories. You can see that both theories believe that behavior can be changed and that there is value to influencers, both positive and negative, to affect the frequency of any kind of behavior. Some of the differences, as you can see, that the behavioral side really valued the external forces, whereas the social valued both internal and external forces. Behavioral believed in the value of practice and experience, whereas social also valued the will and the mind. And then on the social side, specifically, that responses can be conditioned and can be practiced, but are not always predictable. That you have to include the will and the motivation piece behind it. So that is what we have. And if you'd like to read more and learn more, I've listed a lot of different articles and research there. So thank you. Have a great day.